Okay, I think we're recording. Welcome everyone. I'm glad you could be here today. My name is Dan Inkster. I'm a professor at the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston, and I'm the director of the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center on Ethics and Leadership, which is the sponsor of these events, these Care Ethics Zoom lectures, which we've been doing for about a year now. I'm very excited about today's event. Our speaker, Carol Gilligan, really needs no introduction among this crowd, but I'll give you a brief introduction anyway, just to maybe catch you up to date on things. She's University Professor of Applied Psychology and Humanities at New York University. Her book, In a Different Voice, has been described as, quote, the little book that started a revolution. The fact that we're all here today is living proof of that fact. After In a Different Voice, Professor Gilligan published a string of books on women's psychology and girls' development, including Mapping the Moral Domain, Making Connections, and Meeting at the Crossroads, Women's Psychology and Girls' Development, which was a New York Times notable book of the year. More recently, she's written a number of insightful books on the current political and social conditions with titles like The Deepening Darkness, Joining the Resistance, Darkness Now Visible, and Why Does Patriarchy Persist? From various angles, these books explore how the culture of patriarchy, with its binary gender codes, alienates us from our emotions and relationships and lies beneath much of the animosity that pervades our current political climate. If you haven't taken a look at these books, I highly recommend them. I've learned a lot from them. They've really helped frame my thinking about a lot of what's going on in the United States and other parts of the world these days where authoritarianism has crept in. So most of you probably know, most of these details about Professor Gilligan and her accomplishments. So let me add a couple things that maybe some of you don't know as much about. 2008, she published a novel with Random House entitled Kira. She co-wrote a play with her son, Jonathan, entitled The Scarlet Letter, which premiered in New York City in 2005 and then became the libretto for an opera, Pearl, which premiered in 2013. Spending time with her a couple years ago, which I had, which was a great experience for me, I was struck by the broad range of art, humanities, and other interests she has. I was also struck by the centrality of finding one's voice, not just her research and teaching, but really her very being. I felt like talking to her, it just, this idea really just emanates out of her. And just in the discussion before we got started today, she's talking about how she's teaching this course on listening and radical listening, which is I remember her talking about when she visited Houston a couple years ago, and it's really striking. That this is not just that kind of an intellectual theme that she pursues, but something that I think is really very much part of who she is. Which all, of course, brings us back to today's talk, where Professor Gilligan will revisit her landmark book In a Different Voice and ask, why does nobody talk about the abortion decisions? A very intriguing question. So Professor Gilligan will talk for about 30 minutes. I'll make some very, very brief comments right after she's finished, and then we'll open the floor to questions and discussion. If you have a question, please, I think the easiest thing, and this is what we've done in the past, is just to go to the chat and write, I have a question, and send it to me. And then I'll call on you in order. I find that easier than using the hand tool, just because I can never find the raise hand tool. Maybe some of you are more adept at this kind of thing than I am, but just go to chat, right? I have a question, hit return, send it to me, and I'll get your questions in order. So let me now step aside and hand the floor over to Professor Gilligan. But finally, let me just thank you profusely for being here today, and I can't wait to hear your talk.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. First of all, I had a great time in Houston. When was that? How many years ago? Two,
three, maybe?
3, something like that. And I was thrilled when Dan called me and invited me to come, because I really have a question for all of you. So I'm just going to lay the background for my question. and then we can talk about it. So let me start. My title is In a Different Voice, Why Nobody Talks About the Abortion Decisions. The year is 1973. President Nixon has ended the Vietnam War draft, and the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade has legalized abortion. I am teaching part-time at Harvard. My PhD is in psychology, and since receiving my degree in 1964, I have taught with Erik Erikson and also with Lawrence Kohlberg. And in fact, it was the inspiration of their work that drew me back into the field of psychology. Still, I was the mother of 3 young children, a modern dancer, and active in the civil rights and the anti-war movements. As an undergraduate at Swarthmore, I had majored in English literature, and perhaps it was that in part that spurred my interest in how people think about themselves and about morality when they are facing situations of conflict and choice. I was interested in questions of identity and morality, or as Larry Kohlberg put it at the time, in the relationship between judgment and action. And so, noticing a reticence among the men in the discussion sections of Kohlberg's course on moral and political choice that I was leading, their outspokenness when it came to talking about the Vietnam War, which most of them considered unjust, but their silence when the subject became whether or not one should resist the draft, a choice which upon graduation they would actually face, I decided I would follow those students and interview them when they were college seniors and the draft decision was upon them. And then President Nixon ended the draft. So it was that the locus of my study shifted. I was looking for a situation where people have to make a choice, where the roads diverge, and you have to decide which way will I go. And I was interested in who is the I in that question. What happened to identity at moments in one's life where one is faced with that kind of a choice? And did moral language come into play? Words such as right, wrong, should, ought, just that. How did concerns about conceptions of identity and morality come into play, not in the hypothetical problem solving, but in actual situations where you have to live with the consequences of your decision? So in other words, I was interested in real rather than hypothetical moral dilemmas. And the Supreme Court came to my aid. In Roe v. Wade in 1973, my study would focus on abortion decisions, where people would come to a public place, pregnancy counseling services, and the decision would be made within a limited time frame. At the time, it didn't strike me that the participants in the draft decision study were men, and in the abortion decision study, women. My interest was in identity and moral development. Between 1973 and 1975, Mary Belenke, then a graduate student at Harvard, and also my neighbor and friend, and I interviewed 29 women who were in the first trimester of a confirmed pregnancy and who were considering abortion. The women were referred to our study from street front clinics in Boston's South End, from pregnancy counseling services, preterm and Planned Parenthood, and from college counseling services. I should say the college counseling services, it's always interesting who gets sent to you in these situations. And the people who got sent from the college counseling services were mostly women of color. So I just tell you that. Some of the teenagers especially were referred by counselors who were concerned about repeated abortions. Some women came, I think, because they were unsure about their decisions and welcomed the opportunity to talk, and some because they wanted to contribute to research, at least as far as I knew. The women ranged in age from 15 to 33 and were diverse in race, ethnicity, and social class. Of the 29 women, 4 decided to have the baby, 2 miscarried, 21 chose to have an abortion, and 2 were undecided at the time of the interview and could not be contacted at the time of the follow-up study. Of the 29 women referred to the study, complete interview data were available for 24, and of these 24, 21 were interviewed again at the end of the following year. In the winter of 1975-76, my husband and I had moved from one suburb of Boston to the other. For our children, it was like moving from one world to the other, because from them it meant new schools, new friends, and a new neighborhood to get used to. I stayed home that year to help them adjust to the change. I had a small research stipend to support the abortion decision study. And during the days when the children were in school, I would read through the interviews that Mary and I had conducted. It was during that winter, one day, that remains etched in my memory, that my friend Dora Julian came over. She was a graduate student studying psychology at Harvard, also interested in moral development. And we were in the kitchen where I had been reading through the interview transcripts when I said, "You know, Dora, I understand why psychologists have so much trouble understanding women." At the time I was teaching and she was studying Freud and Erikson, Piaget and Kohlberg, all of whom had confessed to being puzzled by women, whom they observed to be less developed than men, both in their sense of self and in their capacity for moral judgment. Freud wrote that women have less sense of justice than men, and women tended to score lower than men, typically stage 3, on Kohlberg's 6-stage scale of moral development. To Erikson, women fused or confused the stage of identity with the stage of intimacy. And to Piaget, girls, in contrast to boys, gave priority to relationships over rules. What I had observed in reading through the interviews with women was a tendency for women to construct moral problems differently, to start, as it were, from a different place, that is, from an assumption of connectedness rather than of separateness. I said some such thing to Dora, and she said to me, "That's interesting, you should write about it." And that's the origin of In a Different Voice. First, the 1977 Harvard Ed Review article, and then the 1982 book. The abortion decision study was the impetus for the article and the centerpiece of the book, the focus of its 2 central chapters, Chapter 3, Concepts of Self and Morality, and Chapter 4, Crisis and Transition. And as far as I'm aware, and my research here has been largely on Google, despite all the talk about In a Different Voice, there has been a radio silence around the abortion decision study. It's almost never mentioned, and if mentioned, almost exclusively by me. So when Dan Anster invited me to be part of this series of lectures on care ethics, I thought, here's the opportunity. Because I have been wanting to talk with the care ethics community about exactly this question. The abortion decision study was the origin, the impetus for writing about a different voice, and the grounds for my thinking about care ethics. And yet, it's almost never talked about. Here are the key points I want to introduce by way of a prelude to what I hope will be a lively discussion. First, the political context. In 1973, the US Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade gave women a legitimate voice in deciding whether to continue or abort a pregnancy. In essence, the highest court in the land legitimized women's right to have a voice in making this decision. True, in consultation with her doctors, but nevertheless a decisive voice and a right to make the choice. In this, the authority of the court would be pitted against other authorities, such as the church or fathers, so that the authorities themselves were in conflict. But the court, in legitimizing women's voices and their right to make this decision, also was up against a tradition of feminine goodness that equated goodness for women with selflessness. This was the morality of the so-called angel in the house, that icon of Coventry Patmore's poem, immortalized by Virginia Woolf. She is the epitome of feminine goodness, the woman who responds to the needs and concerns of others, the endlessly caring woman who seemingly has no voice or needs of her own. Second, the psychological context. Kohlberg's 6 stages of moral development were derived empirically from his longitudinal study of 84 white boys, varied in social class, and followed from adolescence into adulthood. The stages were explicitly, in Kohlberg's terms, stages of moral reasoning within a framework where, as Socrates put it, virtue is one and its name is justice. Kohlberg referred to his stages as stages of justice reasoning, and his moral stages aligned with, and in fact were contingent on Piaget's stages of cognitive development, which track the move from concrete to formal operational thought. They also were in line with stage theories of ego or identity development, part of a paradigm that had been unquestioned. As I wrote in the opening paragraph of the 1977 Ed Review article, the arc of developmental theory leads from infantile dependence to adult autonomy. It was a path marked by steps toward rationality and autonomy, which were equated with maturity. Third, and with this political and psychological backdrop in mind, the abortion decision study and care ethics. In the interest of literally retracing the steps that led me to write about care ethics, I will start with chapter 3 of In a Different Voice, Concepts of Self and Morality. The chapter begins with quotations from interviews with college women, Harvard students, or Radcliffe students, as they were called at the time, speaking about morality and about themselves. The most salient theme in the women's responses to questions such as, if you had to say what morality means to you, how would you sum it up, was a concern about hurting, a wish not to hurt others, and the hope that in morality lies a way of resolving conflicts so that no one will be hurt. A second note sounded by these women was a sense of vulnerability that impeded them from taking a stand. What George Eliot had characterized as the girl's susceptibility to adverse judgments by others, which stems from her lack of power and consequent inability, quote, to do something in the world. With the abortion decision study, however, the parameters had shifted. As I wrote, to go beyond the question, how much like men do women think? How capable are they of engaging in the abstract and hypothetical construction of reality? It was necessary to find, quote, places where women have the power to choose and thus are willing to speak in their own voice. However, as I also observed, quote, while society may affirm publicly the woman's right to choose for herself, the exercise of such choice brings her privately into conflict with conventions of femininity and particularly the moral equation of goodness with self-sacrifice. And here is the nub of the question I'm hoping to consider with you today. Whether the anchoring of my discussion of care ethics in the abortion decision study led to an understanding of care and care ethics that is at odds with the morality of the angel in the house. Because of all things one can imagine the angel doing, abortion is not on the list. Let me quote a bit further from the In a Different Voice, as I lay out the centrality of the abortion decision study to my thinking about care ethics. Quote, when a woman considers whether to continue or abort a pregnancy, she contemplates a decision that affects both self and others and engages directly the critical moral issue of hurting. Since the choice is ultimately hers, and therefore one for which she is responsible, it raises precisely those questions of judgment that have been most problematic for women. Now she is asked whether she wishes to interrupt that stream of life, which for centuries has immersed her in the passivity of dependence, while at the same time imposing on her the responsibility for care. Thus, the abortion decision brings to the core of feminine apprehension for what Joan Didion calls, quote, the irreconcilable difference of it, that sense of living one's deepest life underwater, that dark involvement with birth and blood, and with blood and birth and death, the adult questions of responsibility and choice. The key terms here are self and others, hurting, life and death, responsibility and choice, women and care. The choice of the abortion decision study as my impetus for writing about care ethics made it clear from the beginning that my understanding of care ethics is not linked to an idealized image of caring or what caring entails. Conceived in this context, care ethics engages the critical issues of responsibility and choice in situations where hurting is inescapable and matters of life and death are at stake. To the question, can one be a good woman and have an abortion? I joined the question, can one be a good woman and have a voice? The words selfish and responsible recurred throughout the interviews with women, delineating the parameters of moral choice as they construed it. Defining the moral problem as one of obligation to exercise care and avoid hurt, women would use the word selfish to denote the infliction of hurt, considered immoral in its reflection of unconcern, while the expression of care was seen as the fulfillment of moral responsibility. It was their reiterative use of the words selfish and responsible in talking about moral conflict and choice that set these women apart from the men whom Kohlberg had studied and pointed toward a different understanding of moral development. As women moved into, and then for some beyond the conventions of feminine goodness, to question the equation of selflessness with goodness, they came to see selflessness as morally problematic, signifying an abdication of voice and an evasion of responsibility and relationship. Rather than a solution to moral conflict, that is, a willingness to protect others at one's own expense, selflessness became a moral problem, a taking of the self out of relationship. In my understanding, this was the psychological transformation precipitated by this historical moment. The political shift that gave women a legitimate voice had placed them in conflict with the moral traditions that had equated women's silence with women's goodness. As a side note, though one to which I hope we will return, I think this is why abortion remains so contentious, because what is at stake in the so-called right to choice is a woman's right to have a voice, to speak for herself, and thus to break a silence integral to maintaining a patriarchal order. In our 2018 book, Why Does Patriarchy Persist?, Naomi Snyder and I observed that given the tension between human psychology and the structures of patriarchy, that is, between the relational capacities now recognized as integral to our ability to survive and to thrive, and the sacrifice of relationship necessary for establishing and maintaining a hierarchy, that is, some people deemed more human than others, the continuation of a patriarchal order depends on male violence or the threat of male violence and on female silence. If we think of the recent Texas ruling that not only prohibits abortion after 6 weeks following a woman's last menstrual period, but also subjects anyone who comes to the aid of a woman seeking an abortion after that deadline to a $10,000 fine. If we envision, say, a girl who becomes pregnant after having been raped by a stranger or by a member of her family, in which case the rape is called incest, a girl who may not even have kept track of her last menstrual period, with the new Texas law imposes a penalty on anyone who should come to her aid in ending such a pregnancy. In effect, a wall of silence has been erected around her. In my interviews with pregnant women in the mid-1970s, In the immediate aftermath of Roe v. Wade, I was struck by a woman's use of the word selfish to denote whatever it was that she wanted to do, whether to have the baby or to have an abortion. Whereas doing what others wanted her to do or thought she should do was, quote, good. I remember in particular a woman in her mid-20s. Her partner, it could have been her husband, was a law student. And as she explained, she was planning to have an abortion because he depended on her support to finish law school. That is, he wanted her to abort the pregnancy. I remember saying I understood that, but what did she want to do? She looked at me as if, how could I even ask such a question? What's wrong with helping people you love? She asked me. Nothing, I said, and repeated my question. After several iterations of this conversation, with the word selfish ringing in my ears, I began asking women, if it's good to be empathic with people and responsive to their needs and concerns, you're a person, why is it selfish to respond to yourself? And in that historical moment, woman after woman said, good question. That was the epiphany in my writing about care ethics. A political shift was precipitating or laying the ground for a psychological transformation. At the core of this transformation was an understanding of relationship and responsibility that called into question the opposition of selfishness and selflessness in light of the interdependence of self and others, and thus the necessity of including both self and other in the compass of one's care and concern. Similarly, moral dilemmas were seen to arise in situations where hurt was inescapable. The moral imperative thus became an injunction to care, a responsibility, and this is a quote from In a Different Voice, to discern and alleviate the real and recognizable trouble of this world. Sharon, a woman in her 30s, when questioned about the right way to make moral decisions, says, the only way I know is to try to be as awake as possible, to try to know the range of what you feel, to try to consider all that's involved, to be as aware as you can of what's going on, as conscious as you can of where you're walking. Asked if there are principles that guide her, she responds by saying the principle would have something to do with responsibility and caring about yourself and others. But it's not that on the one hand you choose to be responsible and on the other hand you choose to be irresponsible. Both ways you can be responsible. That's why there's not just a principle that once you take hold of, you settle. The principle put into practice here is still going to leave you with conflict. I will end then with a final paragraph of chapter 4 of In a Different Voice, the second of the 2 chapters on the illumination of the abortion decision study. As one of the women says, crisis reveals character. That crisis also creates character is the essence of a developmental approach. Quote, the changes described in women's thinking about responsibility and relationships suggest that the capacity for responsibility and care evolves through a coherent sequence of feelings and thoughts. As the events of women's lives and of history intersect with their feelings and thoughts, a concern with individual survival comes to be branded as, quote, selfish, and to be counterposed to the, quote, responsibility of a life lived in relationships. And in turn, responsibility becomes, in its conventional interpretation, confused with a responsiveness to others that impedes a recognition of self. The truths of relationship, however, return in the rediscovery of connection, in the realization that self and other are interdependent, and that life, however valuable in itself, can only be sustained by care and relationships. As a final observation, it has often struck me that care ethics is burdened by the association of caring with women, and also, by implication, with other people considered lesser, notably people of color, who in reality do the lion's share of care work, often for people who claim autonomy, and thus not to be in need of care. Hence, the caring people must do their work in silence. It also, in other words, they can't have a voice. It also strikes me that many of the moral philosophers who have enhanced the understanding of care ethics are women, whether they have done so indirectly by their focus on the importance of paying attention and listening. I'm thinking here of Simone Weil, Iris Murdoch, and Hannah Arendt, or directly, and here I include many of you. And so my question, why the radio silence around the abortion decision study? I'm not a moral philosopher, but most of what I have come to know about care ethics, the wisdom of its underlying psychological logic, and the ways it shifts thinking about self and morality, I learned primarily from listening to a group of women in the mid-1970s who, for reasons both psychological and political, had come to question the morality of selflessness, and by including themselves in the compass of their care, were shaking the foundations of a patriarchal order. A footnote, or perhaps more accurately, a coda. We seem to have reached collectively a moment of crisis in our relationship with women. I'm thinking of the current proliferation of restrictions on women's access to abortion and the threatened reversal of Roe v. Wade, but also of the failure of Congress, and more specifically the Senate, to pass the Build Back Better bill. Bridges and highways, not to mention the military, are one thing and worthy of our collective support. Yet when it comes to childcare and healthcare, which fall disproportionately on women, not to mention caring for the planet, somehow things get bogged down. My intention here is to raise a question for the care ethics community. Is there currently a crisis of care in both senses of the term, meaning that the need for care has now become critical, arguably essential to our survival as a species and to the survival of the planet as a habitable home? And also, have we reached a critical juncture in our understanding of care? In this, as I see it, there is a need now to decouple care from the binaries of selfishness and selflessness, egoism and altruism, masculine versus feminine, and to recognize these binaries for what they are, that is, mainstays of a patriarchal order. And to this end, I offer the following clarification, which I have to say, it's really interesting to me how long it has taken me to come to this succinct summary of what I personally see as the essence of In a Different Voice. Namely, one, the different voice, which is the voice of care ethics, is a human voice. The voice it differs from is a patriarchal voice. That is a voice bound to gender binaries and hierarchies. And within a patriarchal order, that is within a patriarchal institution, family, society, or culture, the human voice, that is the voice of care ethics, is a voice of resistance. And care ethics, therefore, is an ethic of liberation. Thank you. And please talk with me.
Well, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for that talk. That was a very thought-provoking and moving for me, and I'm sure for everyone else. So I'll clap, and other hands are showing there. So thank you for that wonderful talk. And let me remind you all, if you have questions, what you should do is go down to the bottom, or at least on my screen, bottom center, hit chat, say I have a question, and I will get to you momentarily. I'm going to start us off just with a couple kind of comments and questions, and maybe to give you all a chance to formulate your questions and your discussion with Carol. So let me begin. I mean, I wanted to reflect in advance on your question of why don't we talk about the abortion decision, and so one thing that came to my mind is, initially was just it kind of relates to what you're talking about that's happening here in my state, Texas, with abortion politics, which is that the abortion study, it's very complex thinking that these women are going through, and they're saying a lot, they're saying lots of things about there's no good choice, and I don't know, I don't want to hurt my baby, who they're referring to the fetus as a baby or a child sometimes, and several of them in the follow-up interviews are expressing remorse about the decisions, even when they say, like, I think I made the right decision, but I was depressed for a long time. And so one thing that comes to mind for why people try to avoid that decision is it's messy, and talking about it perhaps runs a danger of falling into the hands of political opponents who are going to use all this to try to make the point to make a substantive point as opposed to the reasoning point that you're making about the process by which women made this decision. So that led me to this question, which I think you answered, but I want to make sure I understood your answer in your talk, which was what is lost if we don't talk about the abortion decisions in a different voice? If we just focus on kind of the neater, cleaner, easier, Amy and Jake's response to the high dilemma.
I love it. I just love it. In a different voice, I'm often told, is a book about children's moral reasoning. And the reason I think that's it is there are literally two children, Amy and Jake, and they appear for maybe 20 pages. And I mean, it's so interesting to me, this displacement of women's voices, because the majority of the book is about women's voices. I mean, it's not about children. I mean, Amy and Jake are two 11-year-olds, and it's just they appear for a short thing. But it's like listening to women. I mean, you want my answer? Women's voices challenge. It kind of shakes the foundations of patriarchy. Patriarchy depends on women's silence. And specifically, patriarchy depends on women doing the caring work, women along with other people of color and so forth, but not talking about it, because to talk about what we do would be to expose the vulnerability, the nakedness, the dependency of men, which are not, that they're. So, what I think honestly is that to talk about the abortion decision study, first of all, it just pulls the rug out of the idealization of caring, because basically there's what is from if I could put it, patriarchal, a traditional point of view. I mean, women are saying something, and that was what got me in the study. I mean, when I did the study, I realized how if women said what many of the women, not all women, that's by any means, said, I heard exactly how they would be misunderstood, because I heard women say the fetus is a life, no question. If I can continue this pregnancy, I will have a baby. But abortion may be the better thing to do. So in other words, in the tradition of right to life, they're saying murder is okay, it's the right thing to do. I mean, in other words, it was such a translation problem that I understood why you couldn't introduce this voice and continue speaking about abortion in the way that we still speak about it, as a right to life and right to choice, as though the woman and the fetus are basically engaged as opponents in a contest of rights where one has to win and the other loses. And the loss of the woman, if the fetus wins, she's forced to have a baby. I mean, we can go to Amy Coney Barrett. Oh, of course, she can just drop it at a fire station, no problem. The 9 months, so what? I mean, that's fine, because caring is supposed to be selfless and self-sacrificing. I mean, it's like exposing the undergarments of a patriarchal order. And so this is a silence which has to be maintained. And I think that's why I come back, particularly now, where it seems to me these issues are so in crisis, to this abortion decision study, because there it all was. And we're still fighting about it. I mean, there's large parts of this society which is, hell bent on reversing Roe v. Wade.
So I'm going to do one quick follow-up, and then I'll be quiet because other people have questions and more interesting things to say than me. But my
No,
question,
well, no, you put your finger on the key issue. You cannot listen to this. See, I mean, it just blows care ethics out of the water in terms of, oh, isn't it wonderful? Women are either by nature or by choice just so caring and so willing to sacrifice themselves. And, we do all, I mean, look at what's going on in the pandemic. We take care of the children and we and I mean, this is, so it's like saying, yes, that I always think of what it is last week that a group of young mothers went out on the Boston Common and screamed. I mean, no one wants to hear that.
I mean, if I heard you correctly, then you're also suggesting that the political ethics of care literature and the applied ethics of care literature, it has also, by idealizing this good care, has really missed something important, that the kind of care ethics you heard involves voice, which is not always avoiding hurting, but rather taking responsibility for hurting.
Oh, exactly. In fact, the sense that a moral dilemma arises when you cannot avoid hurt. If you can avoid hurt, then there's no dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that's what you do. But where you have a dilemma is there's no way to act that doesn't, and then to bring oneself in, that it's also immoral to hurt oneself when ideally doesn't hurt anybody. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so, I mean, that's why the abortion dilemma, was so revelatory. And also, I'll tell you one more thing this is psychology here. If I say, I'll go back to the wife of the law student. So she says, I'm having the abortion because my husband, wants to finish law school and he's counting on my support. And I say, but what do you want to do? And she looks at me as though, what kind of, what's wrong, she says, with doing something for someone you love? Well, here's the psychological answer. If you have the abortion because he wants you to have the abortion and you're doing it because you love him, who's responsible for the abortion? Not you, he is. So you will blame him. And so the very act which was undertaken in the name of relationship, of love, is going to in fact explode the relationship, because she's going to hold him responsible. And at some point he's going to say, listen, you didn't have to do it. I just told you what I thought. Why didn't you do what you wanted to do? At which point, she'll. So if you're a psychologist, that's why I wanted to tell you, that's why I wanted to ask you to talk about this with me. I'm a psychologist. I think psychologically, this is an ethic that I understood as underpinned, if I can put it that way, by a psychological logic, that is, by an understanding of relationships. And if I don't take responsibility for my action, I hold other people responsible for what I do. And then if somebody tells me I had the right to do what I wanted to do, I didn't have to do that other thing. I mean, you can just see what happens. And that's what I walked into the middle of inadvertently, because I wanted to recreate the history. I didn't set out to do this. And I thought, whoa, this is a different way of talking about morality. And when I said the different voice is a human voice, and what differentiates it from the patriarchal voice is it bridges the binaries. It joins reason with emotion, the self with relationship, and the mind with the body. So there you are. And therefore it.
All right, well, let me invite Amy Mullen into the conversation, and then Claire McKinney, you're up next.
So thanks so much. So first, I thought I'd try to give a potential answer to your question, since that's what your talk is about, which is that I think that, so I've been teaching feminist philosophy, including your work, for 30 years, and students do typically avoid the abortion decisions. And it's because they often claim, well, this is a decision for women to make. And the whole point about a different voice, we should look at questions that, decisions that both men and women could make. And so that's one way that they tend to avoid it. But even I think more crucially, they can sound very much like they're listening to the voices of pregnant people who don't always identify as women by saying, well, pregnant person's body, pregnant person's choice. Usually, her body, her choice.
Right.
And so it sounds like they're listening, but the only thing that they're prepared to hear is, I've decided that the fetus is not morally considerable, and so it's just my interests that count, right? So they don't actually listen to the voice of women who say, I think this is a morally weighty decision. I feel a pull of responsibility to myself. I feel a pull of responsibility to another. That's what they're not willing to take on. But they can sound like their feminist credentials are terrific because first of all, well, her body, her choice.
Thank you. I'm fascinated by that. That's really, really helpful to me. Thank you.
Claire McKinney?
Hi, thank you so much for this. It was incredibly enriching. And I'm actually in the middle of writing a book about abortion. And one of the things I'm writing about is whether or not there's an ethics of abortion. So I'm actually engaging with these chapters. So this is a phenomenal opportunity for me. And so I apologize if this is too much in the weeds, but I was struck that, the women who you talked to, you said there are a couple who say, well, I have to have an abortion because this is the only way I can survive. And in the text, you kind of describe this as a kind of moral nihilism because they're kind of exempting the moral question by just saying this is a matter, like I have to do this, right? So there's not a morally weighty decision. And I'm sort of wondering if there's a different way to frame that, given how you ended your talk today, which is we are facing these crises of human survival, and how might we think about care ethics in response to that? So I'm just kind of wondering if we should still consider when your informants were saying, I have to do this, there's not really a moral quandary for me, if that is a form of moral nihilism, or if there's a way care ethics can kind of capture what's going on there.
Wow. I mean, to me, there's so many issues wrapped up in your question, which are very interesting. I mean, because I agree with you that the issues of survival are upon us now, but collectively. If I remember, I mean, I talked about the survival, the women who really thought it was a focus just on themselves, where they couldn't hold both themselves and other people together in their thinking. And I would have to look more, I guess I would have to go down into the weeds with you and actually look at the quotations. But I think the question is really important. And I think I might revisit my language because of the issue, where the issue of survival is right now in my thinking. Thank you.
So we have a comment, Azura Crispino, you can come on if you want, or I can read your comment.
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Okay.
So, first of all, it's just such an honor to be in the room with such amazing luminaries that I have studied since grad school. But speaking of rejecting binaries, there has been a shift against formulating the abortion debate as a woman's choice, and instead of being more inclusive on non-binary and trans abortion seekers. I was curious as to what you think about this expansion and how it impacts the rooting of care ethics in the abortion decision.
I don't think that I think it's, to me, I'm a writer, basically. As I told you, my background is in literature. If I wanted to write a book about women's voices, I would have called it In a Woman's Voice. I was not writing about women's voices. I was writing about a different voice. And as it happened, and I tried to reconstruct the history, because I think it was a sheer accident of history that I happened at a particular historical moment. And I really want to emphasize that. When the Supreme Court had legitimized women's voices in an area where morality had silenced women, that I happened to be listening to women, and I heard a way of talking about self and about morality that was different from the voice of psychological theory, my subtitle, Psychological Theory and Women's Development. That women were talking about things that had not been encompassed by psychological theory, in part because by psychological theory, these aspects of human experience were gendered feminine. So I wasn't talking about, and there is, again, I'm writing in a different voice. I started in 75, I start to write, and it's 82 is the book. You could only hear a voice that joined reason with emotion, because reason was masculine and emotion was feminine, as a feminine voice. It was, quote, irrational, or that joined self, masculine, with relationships, feminine, as a feminine voice, because relationships were feminine. I mean, in other words, the voice was heard as feminine. So, I mean, to me, it's immaterial about, it's just that this dilemma blew open, this opposition of self and other. And it doesn't really matter if it was a trans person or a non-binary person. I mean, to me, if you ask me about why the focus now on non-binaries is, I used to teach with Eric Erickson, as I mentioned, and he always said, if you want to know what's the unresolved issue of a time, look at the adolescents, because they're like the fool in the Renaissance play. They're the ones, they're going to speak truth to power. They'll put their finger on it. And the adolescents have their finger on the gender binary. And to me, they're absolutely right. I mean, I think what's interesting to me, and again, I've not, as I said, I come to this as a person from psychology and literature. I'm not basically a philosopher by temperament. That's all very abstract for me. And so I haven't been involved in the evolution of care ethics, except occasionally I'll read something by Joan Tronto, or Michael Sloat will send me his book or something. I'm always interested, but it's not, I don't feel, it's not sort of the way I kind of, think about it.
We got a next question. Jenny Nudelsky.
Thank you. Well, this was a great pleasure to hear you. It was really, really fantastically interesting talk. And so I want to begin by affirming what you said at the end, that thinking about the binaries that you addressed, we really need to see those as part of what keeps a hierarchical structure in place, and the
Right.
role of care in keeping that multiple hierarchies. The way we structure care is designed to keep those hierarchies in place and take advantage of those hierarchies. I wanted to make two comments before then trying to offer a little bit of my answer to your question. So the first is, so I was just finishing or in the last stages of writing a book on restructuring work and care, when I decided with the pandemic that I needed to pause and write a whole new section on care for the earth.
Oh,
Because I really do think that now, the invocation of the word human, now rings a little differently in my mind, because, it's one more hierarchy, actually, right? There's us and there's everything else. And that what's called for is actually rethinking what it means to have a relationship of mutual care and respect, recognizing the care we receive from the earth and have a responsibility to returning it. So that's a kind of expansion of our mode of relationality. The second thing I just wanted to, since it's been raised a couple of times with the pandemic, it's been really shocking to me to see the combination of the recognition at one level of the centrality of care, and then the just institutional obliviousness of the gendered cost. And, universities, I honestly, I have been shocked at how terrible universities have been in recognizing who's bearing the impact of this. So then to the abortion thing. So I really appreciated the language, I think was Amy Mullen added, of a morally weighty decision. Because I think there have been moments, I used to tell my classes in feminist theory that no feminist thinks this is a trivial decision. And then I had dinner with an eminent feminist theorist, who I won't name, who said she thought that that decision should never be any different from what you order for dinner. And I really didn't agree and don't agree. So that the framing of it is, how do we treat this as a morally weighty decision and think about it well? And there's a tension between law and moral ethics. And I think the American approach of this, of framing it in terms of privacy, has really been a disadvantage to everyone in trying to talk about this well, if you want to try to make that your framing. For me, I think, so I was trying to personalize that question, why do I find it hard to talk about? And I think one of the reasons is that it remains an area where an individual right to make that decision is really important. And yet, that is not really how I think we ought to be addressing this. That, right, there needs to be better care. There needs to be better care for pregnant women. There needs to be better care for children. There needs to be better contraception. You know, why this problem is the way it is won't be solved even with good protection for the individual right to make that choice. And so, you know, in American politics, you're really forced into fighting for that individual right, while all these other things that are so important are equally hard to talk about and advance. And then that, you know, that puts you in a dilemma about how to pose the conversation. So
I find that extremely helpful. Thank you so much. Because the way I'm translating it in my mind is we have to change the language before we can talk about this dilemma. That collectively we're in the situation that many of the women who were in my study found themselves in, which is if they said what they really thought, they would be misheard and misunderstood. And that they're within the framework in which they were forced to think in order to enact what they felt under the circumstances, I think would they say maybe would be the better thing to do. They had to basically falsify their thinking to fit it into that. So what we're talking about is until, if you want to sort of use this term, until the paradigm shifts, you really can't talk about the abortions alone. I think that's really, really helpful to me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sarah Miller?
Hi there. So I want to just first express thanks for this talk and also note that it's a real gift for this community to hear you speak when we're together with one another to have this conversation.
Well, for me too.
I'm grateful for that.
Really a gift for me to know, I mean, even in this crazy Zoom world, I mean, you know, to have a chance to speak with you. So it's very mutual.
So I wanted to note briefly first that when I teach in a different voice, which I've done for many, many years, my students do want to talk about the abortion study, right? So interestingly, whereas perhaps it hasn't gotten as much uptake in the care ethics community or in scholarly circles, I think it does in the classroom. And so I just wanted to offer that as a kind of point of contrast. And I'm not quite sure what to make of that, but that is at least my experience. So the question I want to ask, so I'm a moral philosopher and I come at all of this from that perspective.
Where do you teach, by the way?
I teach at Penn State University, so smack dab in the middle of Pennsylvania. So when you were talking about, you know, the interviews with women concerning abortion, you noted that whatever the woman wanted to do was selfish. And you, at one point in your talk, said that you asked, you know, or wanted to ask why it was selfish to respond to yourself empathically if it was good to do so for others, right?
I did. I used to ask women that question.
Yeah, and we might extend that, right, to say, you know, why it would be selfish to think about avoiding harm to oneself when it's good to think about doing so for others. So yeah. I think I have one insight into this. So I think that there's a difference in the morality of a relation with oneself versus the relation with others, right? So think, for example, about the concept of interdependence, right? And so it's very clear what interdependence means between oneself and another, but interdependence with regard to a self relation is less clear. I think also the concept of vulnerability, right? Another key concept for care ethics. It's clear what it means for someone else to be vulnerable to me or for me to be vulnerable to them, but a self relation of vulnerability is somewhat more complex and maybe perplexing. And I'll say just as a final point before asking you the question, that the very kind of foundation for responsibility, when we're thinking about responsibility towards others, there are a host of reasons we might give about why we are responsible towards others, but we're going to have very different reasons why we might be responsible to ourselves. So that's, I think, a possible insight. So what I wanted to do then is to return this to the realm of psychology and ask whether in that discipline, there are perceived differences or conversations about relationships we have with ourselves versus relationships we have with others. So I'm wondering if there's an analogous kind of discussion within psychology that might also shed light on this differential relationship between with self and with others.
Wow. You know, it's so interesting. It strikes me as a philosopher's question.
Yeah, on the nose. I apologize, I think.
No, I think it's actually fascinating. I mean, because it means, I mean, I find my mind trying to shift into a kind of philosophical gear to consider the question, which is, I mean, which I find very interesting, because where my mind tends to go, I mean, sort of automatically, is how hard it is for many women to extend to themselves the care that they extend to others. That it's so, I mean, and it's such a painful subject for many women. I mean, that sense, you know, it's almost as though there's this sense of, if a woman cares for other people, there's this expectation that they will care for her. But for her to see it as legitimate, as morally legitimate, to care for herself as it is to care for others, that was my question. After all, if it's good to care for people, you're a person, why is it selfish to care for yourself? And this sense of, in that moment in the 70s, of being met by woman after woman who looked at me and said, good question. I mean, it was really, so I'm fascinated by your question. It would be really interesting to bring that question to the psychology literature. I don't know that there would be that much to say. I mean, there's certainly a lot about the self, you know, but anyway, that's, I find it really, really interesting, as I said. And, you know, in my own experience, it's more the struggle women have to extend to themselves the care and concern that they feel they should be extending to others.
Yeah, no doubt.
And to see that as, first of all, legitimate, secondly, is good, thirdly, is not selfish. I mean, it comes, you know, even now, I mean, I teach psychology students, I teach law students, and I still hear the word selfish. Well, this is a selfish question. That means this is my question.
Right.
You know, and I sort of say, what? You know? Why is it selfish? And then they get flustered.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question.
Nancy Hirschman.
Thank you, Daniel, for calling on me. Thank you so much, Carol. I've been a fan for years. In fact, I think when I first met you back in the 1990s at the Bunting Institute, I called myself a groupie. But you were very influential to my dissertation and my first book. But I, as Joan and Jenny can say, you know, I don't really write about care anymore. But I do teach in a different voice in a mixed graduate and undergraduate seminar very frequently. And one of the things that has always struck me is, you know, you mentioned Amy Coney Barrett. So it's not that difficult to drop it off at a train station, at a fire station. The dismissive attitude to giving up a child for adoption. But that actually was one of your respondents. I remember from the abortion study said, you know, I've never believed in, you know, having a kid just to give it away, right? Mm-hmm. And the way in which that is not explored. I am a full-fledged, everyone who knows me knows that I think a woman has the right to an abortion for any reason whatsoever. But the way that adoption is structured in this country, I think, provides real harsh disincentives to women and creates a real sense of harm to women to prevent them from considering adoption. And it's similar to what's going on with abortion, and this goes back to Jenny Nadelsky's comment about the lack of support. I mean, the same people who strongly oppose abortion are the same people who strongly oppose welfare, more generous welfare benefits and childcare, things like that. And we find that now in disability. In fact, I see Amber Knight is here in the chat. She's been writing about, she's written about disability, abortion, and the ways in which women who are pregnant with fetuses that are likely to develop disabilities are encouraged to abort. And the whole dynamic of that really plugs into your argument about care and the thing that you just said about the non-reciprocity of care, which is something that I was very concerned about when I was writing about your book, that women assume that there's going to be a reciprocity of care, but the reality is that the care never comes back. And that's one of the reasons why they leave themselves out of the network of relationships, because they think someone else, they sort of assume that someone else is going to put them back in. Someone else is going to mend the hole that they fear they're making with this decision. And nobody else does, because everybody hates women, right? So women have to, as you point out, keep themselves in that network, keep themselves in that web of relationships. And that creates an intrinsic tension, as you've noted, between caring for self, right, and caring for others, when it shouldn't be a dichotomy at all.
Right.
And so I guess my questions are sort of, what's your take on the ways in which adoption figures into the abortion discussion? Why is it that we have never in the public discourse, said, look, it's not just a right. You have to think about the cost to women. I mean, it'd be very easy to talk about how painful the decision to make abortion is. Occasionally you hear someone make a reference to it on the public domain, but not often. But to talk about how much women really grapple with these decisions. These are not easy decisions. They are painful decisions. And the vast majority of women will suffer no matter what they choose. And it's really, I just can't get my head around why that has never been part of the public debate. But also, I'd love to hear your comments about the place of adoption or the lack of it, of attention to it, and the way it's treated in the abortion discussions.
It's interesting because I find myself, as I was listening to you, also thinking about the number of women who have, and I mean, again, this is, see, I haven't talked with these women, so I haven't interviewed them, so I haven't listened to them, so I'm very reluctant to speak about it, because when I speak about the women who were in this abortion decision study, I really did listen to this. It was a small group of women, but I learned so much from listening to them. I was going to say I'm interested in the women who are the surrogates for gay couples, who choose. And I mean, I have nothing systematic to say in response to your question, because I haven't gone there with my own. I mean, it's not something that I've done. I mean, I just, as I said, I was horrified by the casualness of, just carry a child for 9 months and drop it off at a fire station and then go to the grocery store or maybe the gym. And it's like, it's such a bizarre view of the human world. And I guess, my own sense is, even the small kind of exposure I had to there's a range, I think, of women's thinking about abortion. And I think there are, I wouldn't say anything about women as a group. As a matter of fact, another talk I gave recently, I started talking about, we talk about women these days politically, who are we talking about? The 53% of white women who voted for Trump, or the 95% of Black women who voted for Biden? I mean, it's like you can't just say women, as several of you have said. but it was, and I'm certainly, I was not sampling women to find out women's this or that. I listened to a group of people who were facing an actual moral decision, and I heard a different voice, different from the voice that had been the voice of psychological theory. And I said, whoa, where is this voice coming from? And what is it saying? And basically I wrote about it because I thought, this is a voice worth listening to. And some of the conversation today I'm going back to, I have to look at your name, Jennifer, that maybe we can't talk about the abortion decision as long as this right to life, right to choice framework is kind of set in place, because it's just not possible to say what we would need to say to encompass what at least some women were talking about.
Thank you. So we have, there are some comments in the chat from Kathleen Reeves and let's see, Lou Marie Kruger. I'm not sure, let's see. And Rachel Langford, do any of you, are these questions? Let's see, do any of you want to make your comments or have questions? Or let's see, it seems like maybe Rachel Langford's is a question. Go ahead, any of you can jump on if you would like. Let's see. I'll read Rachel Langford's. It says, many thanks for such a thrilling talk. The women you radically listened to were once girls. Can you talk more about what happens in childhood to girls in relation to identity and morality?
Yes, I'd love to talk about that. And I do want to hear from Lou Marie because I haven't seen her since I was in South Africa.
Okay. And then we have a question from Margaret McLaren also. Okay. Go ahead.
But I do want to say that of all the work I've done, and it's very interesting. I mean, In a Different Voice has been, you know, as you know, widely discussed, and you know, it's been criticized and so forth and so on. But the most, from my point of view, radical work I did was the girls' work that followed after I finished In a Different Voice. Well, I'll just give you this little background. In 1980, the Handbook of Adolescent Psychology came out. It was edited by Joe Adelson, very distinguished psychologist at the University of Michigan. And he had asked a leading scholar to write a chapter for his Handbook of Adolescence on female adolescent development. And I mean, that's already bizarre, because what's the book about? But the woman came back, Ann Peterson, leading scholar of adolescence, and said there wasn't enough material to warrant a single chapter. And as Adelson wrote, adolescent girls simply have not been much studied. The psychology of adolescence is the psychology of the male youngster writ large. Now, what that means is, and he said also, which I thought was really insightful, he said, but make no mistake, there's a subtle but pervasive masculine bias, even within this psychology of male adolescence, leading to an overemphasis, and now this should resonate from my talk, on issues of achievement and separation and independence, and a corresponding neglect of nurturance, intimacy, and love. In other words, this psychology of adolescence was a psychology of the male youngster writ large, but it was a distortion of male psychology, says Adelson. So a man who became a principal of a girls' school, Emma Willard, who had come from Groton, which was boys' school, went to the literature to read about adolescent development. And of course, there's no literature about female adolescent development. Nobody studied girls. So he raised the money, came to me and said, you know, would I do a study? And he was going to support my graduate students. And I had just finished a book and I thought, why not? I'll do a piece of just straightforward developmental psychology research. I will follow girls as the narrators of coming of age. I mean, you could actually hear this if you read novels written by women, but it wasn't in the psychology literature. And that blew open the field of psychology for me in a way. And I have to tell you, the work of mine that was really attacked was not In a Different Voice. It was the girls' work, because what that work showed is that what psychologists had called development, milestones on the road to rationality, autonomy, and maturity, was in fact an initiation that forced, in the name of rationality, autonomy, and maturity, a separation of the mind from the body, thoughts from emotions, and the self from relationships. That is, the privileged masculine qualities from the kind of idealized but devalued feminine qualities. And that forced separation, you can read Damasio, the neuroscientist, and you'll find this, or you can read Sarah Hrdy on evolutionary. You split thought from emotion, the self from relationship, you are undercutting or, stunting basic human relational capacities. As Damasio says, the separation of thought from emotion, once considered the sine qua non of rationality, is in fact a manifestation of brain injury or trauma. And all the trauma literature in psychology says the separation of the self from relationships, that's what happens in conditions of trauma. So psychologists had been reading, basically mistaking trauma, an initiation which had some of the hallmarks of trauma, rewriting history, loss of voice and memory, with development. I mean, this was astonishing. And like a healthy body resists infection, a healthy psyche resists the loss of those capacities, those relational capacities, which, as we know from study after study, are essential to our ability to survive and thrive. So girls were resisting an initiation that would compromise their relational capacities, that would force a sacrifice of relationship in the name of having relationships and also in the name of morality. And in other words, that resistance was a healthy resistance to a loss that was both psychologically and politically costly. And it turned into a kind of political resistance. I mean, and now I can tell you, I mean, I just, I don't know if you've noticed, but of course I'm very struck by the voices of girls in our midst that have had an outsized effect. Greta Thunberg, 16-year-old with her one-person climate strike, provoking the largest climate demonstration in history, and Darnella Williams, of all the people who witnessed the murder of George Floyd. It's a teenage girl who holds up her camera and records the event. And both of them said that what was happening wasn't right. I mean, the moral language they used. So basically, what the work on girls showed is that was what led me to say, wait a minute, the different voice is a human voice. And at the point of initiation into the gender binaries and hierarchies that are going to kind of fragment that voice or send parts of it kind of underground, there is a resistance. So, and then after the work on girls, I did this study on 4 and 5-year-old boys. So there's an initiation that starts with boys between 4 and 7, which is time where there's a heightened incident of psychological distress. It then continues with girls as they reach adolescence, where you suddenly see this high incidence of depression and eating disorders and cutting and self-destructive behavior. And then it repeats with boys in late adolescence. And it's really the stunting of those human capacities, which are, I think, integral to morality, but which interfere with the establishment and maintaining of these hierarchies that lead some humans to be seen as superior, whether on the basis of race or class or sexuality, whatnot, and others as inferior. Because that depends on the people on top not having empathy with the people on the bottom, and the people on the bottom not having a voice that anybody listens to. So, in other words, there's a real tension between human psychology and the culture of patriarchy. And so you asked about girls. the revelation of the research with girls. It was 10 years in girls' schools and co-ed schools and after-school programs and girls and boys clubs and so forth and so on. Mostly my women students, we published 5 books together on this work because it was like, wait a minute, I know that voice, the voice of the girl prior to adolescence. And I'll just give you, one, I mean, Toni Morrison's novels, I mean, you can read The Bluest Eye, it's the voice of Claudia. You can read, actually, Euripides, it's the voice of Iphigenia saying to Agamemnon, you're mad for thinking of sacrificing her. And it's the voice of Jane Eyre when her Aunt Reed calls her 10-year-old Jane Eyre, and her Aunt Reed calls her a liar. And Jane Eyre says, this is in Charlotte Bronte's novel, if I were a liar, I would say that I love you when I don't. It's like, oh my God. So that human voice, that I learned that now my whole work on radical listening, which is a whole different subject, and probably don't get into it today, is once you've heard this, that voice goes under, and there's a cover voice, which is very rewarded. It gets you the A in school and gets you into Harvard and everything else. But if you listen for that under voice, I mean, it's like I believe in every woman, there's a 9, 10, 11-year-old girl, who will say what she sees. Oh, I know what I wanted to. And in every man, there's this emotionally intelligent 4 or 5-year-old boy. So here was the example, because it's right out of moral development, and you'll like this. So this is early on in my research, and I'm doing hypothetical moral dilemmas, and I'm interviewing a woman, and I ask her, what should Heinz do? Or what's the question? Should Heinz steal the drug? Right, that's the question. And she looks at me. I don't know if it's my hair. I don't know what it is. But she says to me, would you like to know what I think? Or would you like to know what I really think? And I thought, no, it's taken me a long time to understand fully what she was teaching me. Because what she was saying was she had learned to think about morality in a way that differed from how she really thought. What's more, she was aware of the difference. Thirdly, what would I like to know? Because she could tell me what she thought about morality, or she could tell me what she really thought about morality, depending on what I would like to know. So if you want to get into a discussion of research methods, I mean, you want to do research, you can hear the cover voice, how I think about morality. Or you could hear the under voice, how I really think about morality. And right now, I mean, what I'm listening for is people's use of the words really, actually, what I really think, how I actually feel, or the phrase to be honest, which often introduces the switch from the cover voice to the under voice. That's a long answer to your question, but I mean, so yes, girls, and every woman, there's a girl who, can say what she really thinks and feels, but has learned the rewards to be gained by saying what people would like her to think and feel and know and so forth.
Thank you. Lou Marie Kruger, do you want to ask a question, and then we'll get to Margaret McLaren?
I don't know. I'm here from South Africa. It's late in the evening here, and it's so lovely to meet up with Carol again. We've had lovely times here in South Africa, but so I don't know. I don't know how relevant my questions are from this context, but maybe I will say that, I took notes, and Carol, it's so lovely to listen to you. You've been, how I studied in Boston, and so I've known you for a long time, but your work for a long time, and then I happened to meet you in South Africa a few years ago. But you talked about women's dependence, you talked about the responsibility of care, And then you said something about hurting is inevitable. And for me, as a psychologist practicing in South Africa, my biggest issue is the violence of caring, and how women, because they care, they become destructive and violent. And in your context, you might be thinking about more, I'm really, in my context, it is women who care, and because they care, they beat their children, they become violent, and for me, your work is so precious because you talk about resistance and anger, and I mean in your book, joining the revolution,
Resistance, but it is the revolution.
Yeah, you talk about that angry voice of the girl, and for me, that is your best contribution. That you talk about the angry voice, and that, and we want to idealize caring as this beautiful thing, but the flip side of it is the absolute anger. And in my context, and Amanda must talk to it also, that it becomes almost violent in, women want to care about their children and they become violent in their caring because they care so much. So somehow all of your work is relevant to this, that caring is always, when you care and when you have responsibility, you become intrusive, and the worst side of it is becoming violent. I don't know if this resonates with you at all. I mean, I'm coming from a totally different context, but I know we talked about it when you were here.
I was just going to say, what it's bringing back, Lou Marie, is the conversations we had in your house in South Africa. I mean, I just go right back there. And also, in the book I wrote with Naomi, where we go to the work of John Bowlby on attachment.
Yes.
And one of the things that Bowlby writes about is, first of all, that the natural response to loss is protest. And he talks about the anger of hope, and that when the anger of hope is defeated, that then it gives way to what he calls the anger of despair. And I think that's very relevant to what you're talking about. And again, I mean, I'm so happy to be reminded of these conversations you and I had about this. And I think if there's one thing that I felt that, the whole discussion today of really asking you to talk with me about the abortion decision study and what would it mean to bring it back, as it was the impetus for my writing about care ethics, is you could not idealize care. You couldn't idealize it in those circumstances. As I said, in this sort of, half humorous, I mean, the last thing that the angel in the house would ever do was have an abortion. And, who was talking before about it can be a caring act. It also is a violent act. I mean, that sense of that the moral problem comes when there's no way to avoid hurt. And if one way is to not care. I mean, but that anyway, this is such a gift for me, Dan. I just am so grateful to you for inviting me into this group and this conversation.
Do you have time for one last question from Margaret McLaren? Sure. Okay, and then we'll have to close it out. So Margaret McLaren. Oh, she may no longer be with us. We may have waited too long.
Oh no, there she is. I see her.
I'm here. Yeah,
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't unmute, but I did my video.
Julia Held is here. Hi.
Yeah. thank you so much. I enjoyed your talk. Your work is central to my dissertation, which I finished 30 years ago. I have a quick answer to your question about why abortion doesn't come up as much. I'm also trained in philosophy, and a lot of the work that I've read is in philosophy. And I think moral philosophers focus on the moral development aspect and the piece about moral reasoning and not about abortion. And I also agree with what Jennifer Neldelsky said earlier, that I think framing abortion in terms of rights is not the right move. I think the reproductive justice framework is better for that. But I have a question for you. So at the end of your talk, you said, is there a crisis of care? Yes, I think there clearly is a crisis of care. And so I'm interested in your thoughts on not only the individual ways that we can become more human and be relational and care, but of course there's caregiving and care work. A lot of the work that came out of your book has to do with care itself. And you mentioned the Build Back Better bill. So what are your ideas or suggestions about how to take the ethics of care as an ethics of resistance and a liberatory framework, and how to institutionalize that, and how to sort of shift the ways and the burdens actually of caregiving away from its racialized and gendered, historical context, and to make it more even and reciprocal. So,
well, I mean, that's obviously, I mean, that's a good question to end on, because it's the question that leads to action. It's also a very, very key question. And I think the first thing is to realize that the assimilation of care ethics to that binary framework is a patriarchal move. I mean, somebody said that before, and it holds in place a structure of domination and subordination, and the carers are the subordinates. I mean, it's like making, oh God, I have to reach for my moral development vocabulary. What is caring was a supererogatory duty, not something that you have to do, but that you do out of the goodness of your heart, and so forth. So that what women do is sort of essential, but it's sort of beside the point. I mean, this kind of thing, it's just so outrageous. It gives me a headache to talk about it this way. But I really think it's what I had two suggestions, and one is to recognize that binary framing of care in terms of either selfishness or selflessness or masculine or feminine, or it's a kind of, that's a mainstay of patriarchy. And it holds care in its place where it's absolutely essential and it can't be talked about. I mean, and particularly, that's why women's silence is, because women, as you know, all the things that we do in terms of with respect to children and our closeness with men, we see what can't be seen in men. It's like the tale of the emperor's new clothes. We see that he's naked. We see that he's vulnerable, and you can't say that. So that whole kind of construction of the human world depends on making everyone who's involved in caring silent. You know, I always love I live in New England. So I think of Emerson sitting in his studio, writing about his study, writing about autonomy, and this entire household is maintaining him. And if they have any voice, there goes his autonomy. So his writing about autonomy depends on the silence of all those people. So, first of all, I think it's to expose it, that these binaries. But the second thing, and I think this is very hopeful, is to say that the care voice, which is a voice what made the different voice different was it broke the binaries. It joined reason with emotion, self with relationship, mind with body, and women with humans, if I can put it that way. It broke the binaries. And so to say that the caring voice, the different voice, is a human voice, I think that's crucial. As humans, we have, this is, you can read Sarah Hrdy, Mothers and Others, The Evolutionary Origins of Mutual Understanding. We are born with a capacity, with the rudiments of the requisites for mutual understanding, with the capacity for empathy, mind reading, that's Hrdy's term. Little children discern what's going on in the minds of others. So when we get to the philosophical, the problem of other minds, I have, are you a mind reader? Well, children are mind readers. So it's like empathy, mind reading, and cooperation are human capacities, which from an evolutionary standpoint, this is Hurdy's work, were integral to our survival as a species, because given the long interval between birth and reproductive maturity, the human infant had to engage other people, someone other than the mother, to care for them, otherwise they wouldn't survive. So these are basic human capacities. So basically we have the story wrong. We've been telling a false story about ourselves, but there's been a paradigm shift in the human sciences. That's where I come from. So now we can say the different voice, the voice of care ethics, is a human voice. So we ask the question, how do people lose that voice? That we have a lot of answers to that. Trauma is one very good answer to that. How do people lose that voice? The voice it differs from is a patriarchal voice. Listen for the gender binary and hierarchy, and you can recognize it. And thirdly, in a patriarchal order, or any order that elevates some humans over other humans, the human voice is a voice of resistance. So that tells you that the key is within us. Now that's a very, I mean, I find that a very energizing thing. And, you know, I mean, when you see that some of the people who've had the biggest impact, like Darnella Williams, she's responsible for that policeman getting convicted of the murder, or Greta Thunberg and her climate thing, those people, or you can see it now with younger women. Some of my quote resistors are in Congress now and they don't back down. I mean, that's a human voice. And so you have to build resonance around that voice and join people around it. I really think in a way we have the knowledge now, and I think care ethics, I think, is the ethics of resistance. I think it's the ethics of liberation. It's the ethics of resistance. And that's a very different language than that it's the ethics of the angel in the house. You know? So I think care ethics now with this new, with where we've come to, is ready to take its stand as you know, it's at the center of what I would call a feminist resistance, by which I don't mean just women. I mean, that is how I think of feminism, is the movement to free, to free democracy from patriarchy. I mean, really to liberate a human voice. So anyway, that's where I think we are. And I would love to see the care ethics community come forward with this very, I think it's a very political message, and I think it's a very essential message right now, because if we don't face the costs of carelessness, I mean, both in the human community and also in terms of the climate, I mean, it's hard to think about where we're headed right now. I mean, it's really kind of, so anyway, thank you so much for this. I mean, for me, this has been amazing. I just thank you so much for inviting me to this.
Oh, well, thank you for being here, Care Ethics Community. We have our marching orders from Carol Gilligan. So let's get out there and liberate and resist. You know, that was a fantastic talk. I found that very energizing and inspiring. So thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for everyone for participating. That was great. I have all these crazy notes written all over that I'm going to have to spend the next hour trying to decipher and transcribe it, because yeah, it was just very thought-provoking for me. It was wonderful. Thank you so much to
Thank
everyone.
you. It's so nice to see all of you who I know. I mean, what a treat. I mean, Joan and Virginia, and wow, and then Lou Marie. I mean, amazing.
So March 4th, Sarah Munawar will be here, and I'll send you all an email reminder about that with a link and everything. So until next time.
Danielle.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you.